If you want to understand why so many people spend 40 years winning the financial game of retirement only to lose the psychological one the second they cross the finish line, there is one invisible trap you need to see coming right now. Imagine this. It's your last day. You've hit the number. Your house is paid off, your kids are through college, and you just had the big steak dinner celebrating your final day at the office. You wake up Monday morning, the sun is shining, and for the first time in 4 decades, you have absolutely nothing to do. Most people think this is the dream, but in reality, for a huge percentage of high achievers in the US and Canada, this is the exact moment the retirement trap snaps shut. This trap has nothing to do with your 401k balance or inflation-adjusted withdrawal rates. It's a trap of the mind. You are so focused on the math of the exit that you are completely ignoring the chemistry of the aftermath. You've spent 40 years building a mountain of wealth, only to realize that once you're at the top, the air is too thin to breathe. If you can understand the 5 specific regrets that haunt retirees more than a market crash ever could, you won't just retire wealthy, you will actually retire happy.
The common belief we are sold from the time we get our first paycheck is that retirement is a math problem. We are told that if the number is big enough, the happiness is guaranteed. We treat life like a mountain climb where the peak is age 65, and once we reach it, we can just sit down and enjoy the view forever. This is the great lie of the modern workforce. We have been conditioned to believe that labor is the enemy and leisure is the cure. We spend decades grinding so that one day we can finally stop. But here is the hidden truth that no financial advisor is going to tell you in a boardroom. Your brain does not actually want to stop. Your brain is a problem-solving machine that has been calibrated by 40 years of deadlines, social hierarchies, and professional missions. When you suddenly remove the friction of work, you don't get peace, you get a vacuum. And in that vacuum, the 5 regrets we are about to walk through begin to grow like a virus.
The first, and perhaps most jarring regret, is the silence of the morning commute. Now, nobody actually misses sitting in bumper-to-bumper traffic on the I-95 or the 401, but what they realize too late is that the commute was a psychological bridge. Meet David. David was a senior project manager for an engineering firm in Chicago. For 30 years, his alarm went off at 6 a.m. He had a specific ritual: the smell of the French press, the sound of the garage door opening, and that 45-minute drive where he listened to the news and mentally armored up for the day. That commute was the space where he transitioned from dad to the boss. It was a ritual of readiness. When David retired, that bridge was demolished. On his first Tuesday morning of retirement, he woke up at 6 a.m. out of habit, but there was nowhere to go. He sat at his kitchen table with his coffee, looking at his wife, and realized, for the first time in nearly half a century, nobody was expecting him anywhere. There was no mission. There was no problem that only David could solve. For the first few weeks, this feels like a vacation. You sleep in, you take a slow breakfast, but by month 6, it feels like an identity crisis. The regret here isn't that David misses the work, it's the realization that he didn't build a self that exists outside of production. He realized he was so busy being a project manager that he forgot how to just be a person who enjoys a Tuesday morning without a productivity goal. If you don't have a reason to get out of bed that is bigger than a paycheck, the silence of that morning commute will eventually become deafening. This leads us directly into the second regret, which is the social echo. We tend to vastly underestimate how much of our social fabric is held together by the water cooler. Most of your friendships over the last few decades have likely been contextual. You are friends because you share a boss, a project, or a common enemy in the accounting department. Consider Sarah. Sarah was a high-level marketing executive. She had a work family she spent 10 hours a day with. They grabbed drinks after work, they vented about clients, and they shared a unique language of inside jokes. Sarah assumed these people were her lifelong friends. But 3 months after her retirement party, the texts stopped.
She reached out to her old team for lunch, but they were in the middle of a crunch period. They were busy. They were stressed. They were moving at 100 miles per hour while Sarah was standing still in her living room. When they did finally meet for lunch, the conversation felt forced. They talked about office politics Sarah was no longer part of. She felt like a ghost haunting her own life. The regret here is realizing that you spent 40 years building a professional network but forgot to build a local community. Many retirees find themselves in a beautiful house in a quiet neighborhood, realizing that their social muscle has been atrophied for years. You're surrounded by neighbors whose names you barely know, and your work family has moved on to the next project. You have the money to travel the world, but you realize you have no one to share the stories with when you get back.
The third regret is the complexity gap. This is a psychological insight that hits high performers the hardest. Throughout your career, your brain got addicted to high-stakes dopamine. You were managing million-dollar budgets or navigating complex technical systems. Think about Michael. Michael was a surgeon. For decades, his brain was wired to perform under extreme pressure. Every day was a series of high-stakes, non-obvious problems that only he could fix. When he retired, he thought he would love spending his days on the golf course. But within 6 months, Michael was miserable. Why? Because golf isn't a high-stakes problem. The complexity of picking the right club didn't scratch the itch of saving a life. His brain was starving for the weight of responsibility. This is the dopamine drop-off. When you go from solving 9/10 difficulty problems to 2/10 difficulty problems, like what time the pharmacy opens, your brain begins to eat itself. Retirees often regret not finding a high-stakes hobby before they left the workforce, something that demands mastery and carries the risk of failure. Without a challenge, your cognitive faculties begin to decline. You don't just lose your job, you lose your edge. Michael's regret wasn't the loss of the salary, it was the loss of feeling capable. Then comes the fourth regret, the invisible status drop. In North America, our first question to a stranger is almost always, "So, what do you do?" We use work as a shortcut to determine where someone fits in the social hierarchy. Look at Robert. Robert was a vice president at a major bank. When he walked into a room, people stood up. When he sent an email, people replied in minutes. He had status. The day after he retired, Robert went to the local hardware store. He was struggling with a plumbing part and asked a young clerk for help. The clerk was dismissive, barely looking up from his phone. In that moment, Robert realized he wasn't the VP anymore. He was just an old guy who didn't know how to fix a sink. This is the status crash. You realize that much of the respect you enjoyed was tied to your desk, not your soul. People returned your calls because of the company logo on your business card. This causes a deep sense of regret for not diversifying your ego. If your entire sense of worth is tied to your professional title, you are in for a very lonely transition when that title is taken away and replaced by a blank space on a name tag. You regret not being the person who is respected for who they are, rather than what they represent. The final and most profound regret is the wasted vitality. There is a tragic irony in the way we structure our lives. We spend our health-rich years trading our time for money, assuming we can use that money to buy back our time later. This is the story of Linda and Tom. They spent 30 years saving every penny. They skipped the European vacations in their 40s to ensure their retirement bucket was overflowing. They finally retired at 67 with more money than they could ever spend. But 2 months into retirement, Tom's back gave out. Linda found that her chronic fatigue made long flights unbearable. They had the money for the Himalayan trek, but their bodies wouldn't let them do it. They sat in their expensive home looking at travel brochures for places they could no longer physically inhabit. The regret here is the time paradox. Time at 30 is a different currency than time at 70. You can't just save life for later.
People regret waiting for a someday that arrived only after their physical and mental agility had peaked. They realized they saved for a life they are now too tired to lead.
The big realization you need to have right now is that retirement isn't a financial event, it's a lifestyle design challenge. If you only solve for the money, you are only solving for 20% of the equation. The other 80% is figuring out who you are going to be when the world stops asking you to produce. You need to start practicing your retirement self today. You need a mindset portfolio that is just as diversified as your financial one. Invest in community. Find a group that doesn't care what your job was. Invest in complexity. Find a skill like coding, woodworking, or a new language that frustrates you and keeps your brain sharp. Invest in identity. Build a version of yourself that is proud to stand in a grocery store line without a VP title. The most successful retirees aren't the ones with the biggest portfolios. They're the ones who arrived at the finish line and realized they had already built a life they didn't need to escape from. Don't let your golden years be defined by the silence of a phone that stopped ringing. Start building that reason to cross the morning bridge today. Because while money can buy you a very comfortable chair, it can't buy you a reason to get out of it. Thanks for watching, and if you're worried about the identity gap, make sure you're working on the man or woman behind the title before the title is gone for good.